Just before I start, there are discussions about exactly what millennials are, and if they're not millennials, what else they are. Just as a general rule, I'm using the term here for anyone 30 and under, and if you want to add them a little older, that's fine. So I know it's not exactly precise, but my students told me that they really hated being called the iGen, so not going to do that. For the last few years, liberal students like those I teach, students undoubtedly like many of you, have been the target of critics on both the political right and the left. They are, you are, they say coddled, ridiculously emotional, sensitive, prone to fragility, demanding safe spaces and trigger warnings. Millennials say their critics lack toughness and can't deal with the, sorry, I lost my place. And can't deal with the give and take of argument, preferring political correctness to free speech. Parents are too emotionally enmeshed with their children. They overestimate their children's talents and uniqueness and indulge and infantilize them. Borrowing an epithet from Fight Club, critics dismiss students as liberal snowflakes, wishing perhaps that in the scorching blowback of making America great again, that they, and maybe some of you, might all melt away. Maybe there are young people that are like snowflakes, that overestimate their uniqueness, lack grit, are overly dependent upon their parents, and dissolve in the face of pressure. But this does not describe the students I teach. While my students do tend to be politically left of center, their similarity to critics' descriptions of them ends. For one thing, my classroom is simply too pluralistic to achieve anything like the political correctness for which the media so frequently condemns the academy. While it is true that my aim is to create a classroom that resembles, I think, the frequently media-derided safe spaces that enable dynamic intellectual thought, argument, and learning, should my efforts to create such a classroom be passed off as a simple matter of political correctness? If to be politically correct is to decenter one's perspectives and beliefs, to be sensitive to the very different histories, cultures, and experience of students whose own experiences can be wildly different from one another's or from mine, then yes, many if not most of my colleagues and I work hard to orient our teaching to a more plural intellectual world than the ones that many of us were exposed to in graduate school. And we actively work to make our classrooms places where nationality, race, class, gender, disability, and sexuality can be discussed, analyzed, questioned, and criticized without emotional violence, though that does not mean without emotion. When notions of rights, freedom, power, equity, and inequity are on the table, discussions about them provoke emotions. After all, they touch the heart of who we are and often call the nature and legitimacy of our identities into question. Believing that people should remain emotionless about such issues, able to listen calmly to the reiterations of racist or women-hating claims because civility requires that both sides be heard, is to have accepted a far too simple story about the relationship between reason and emotion. It is to ignore the operations of power both in and outside of the academy, and to reduce civility to the enactment of a discourse of I say, you say, all devoid of judgments of intellectual value. This is not to say that recognizing the reality of difference and coping with the socially complex questions that it raises does not take effort, and even, if you like, a certain kind of political orientation. But it does not lead to necessary agreement about many political issues or to an inability to weigh the value of different intellectual claims. I have found that my students, for the most part, are open to readings and arguments that stretch their views of themselves and their understanding of the world. And while sometimes their academic and life experiences change their beliefs, even when they don't, it doesn't mean that they aren't changed by their encounters with difference. One can, as T.S. Eliot so poignantly put it, return home only to be able to see it again for the first time. That my students aren't the liberal snowflakes unable to brook challenges to their own views of the world that right-wing pundits describe them to be, does not mean that they do not struggle to cope with life. As any campus administrator can tell you, greater numbers of current and recent students suffer from anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and are at an increased risk of suicide. Jean Twenge, who has made an excellent career describing what is wrong with young people, writes that, quote, it's what she calls you, is on the verge of the most severe mental health crisis for young people in generations. Why do our current students suffer from more mental health issues than earlier generations? Twenge suggests that a key factor is social media connections have replaced actual friendships. And because the curated lives that young people construct on media can make many feel that their own lives, in comparison to those they view online, are unsuccessful or socially impoverished. As Twenge writes, quote, as teens spend less time with their friends in person and more time on their phones, their life satisfactions dropped with astonishing speed, end quote. I don't doubt that social media can make most of us feel inadequate in all sorts of ways. And I am sure that for some, social media can wind up making us more lonely than we would be without it. But from what I can see, and from the empirical research on college students and friendship, it seems that actual friendships remain deeply important and very present in the lives of students like mine. Indeed, balancing the needs of their friends and the demands of their classes is something that some of my students struggle with. I often get apologies from students who have missed a class or come unprepared because they spent the night with a friend in crisis. While sometimes they or their friends are struggling with chronic illness or suddenly hit by disease or have parents or grandparents who die while they are in school, most of the emergencies my students face are mental health ones, triggered by their own or their friends' depression and/or anxiety. Why, if not due to the increased importance of social media and a lack of actual friends, are so many gifted, hardworking students suffering from mental health issues that threaten their undoing? Parents are often blamed for students' vulnerability to stress, anxiety, and depression. By now, the epithet helicopter parent is widely invoked as people criticize parents who can't seem to step back as their children mature and allow them to make their own decisions and learn from their own mistakes. In the early 2000s, Sharon Hayes and Anne LaRue identified a style of parenting that they called concerted cultivation and contrasted it to parenting that aimed for the accomplishment of natural growth. The former, the concerted cultivation, was the ideal of parenting that tended to be embraced by the upper and middle class parents, while the latter was more likely to be adopted by working class and poor parents who, even if they did adopt its ideals, couldn't afford the costs of tutoring, supervision, sports, music, lessons, schools, and internships required for cultivated parenting. Recently, research by Patrick Izuka suggests that intensive parenting, pretty much the same thing as the described cultivation parenting before, this intensive parenting has become the ideal of not only upper and middle class parents, but of parents from all social classes. Even parents who can't or won't adopt intensive parenting strategies now believe that it would be better for their children if they did. I also suspect that this parenting style has been adopted by not just North American parents, but by relatively solvent and educated parents across the world. Chinese parents, for example, certainly cultivate their children in just the ways that Izuko describes. The Chinese government was even alarmed enough by high rates of adolescent suicides and other signs of mental stress to recently initiate a campaign aimed at persuading parents to put less pressure on their children and to allow them more free time. In addition to the mental stress children suffer from around-the-clock lessons, supervision, and exam preparation, the Chinese have for some time now worried about the deadening of creativity and originality, some blamed on traditional forms of Chinese undergraduate education. While liberal arts colleges may be struggling to survive in the US, ironically, they are being constructed in China in significant numbers, and there is ongoing experimentation with Socratic forms of education in both high schools and colleges. Too much regimentation and high-stress educational systems the Chinese government has come to recognize can extract a high psychic price as adolescents strive to excel, particularly while also preparing for the rigorous standardized university entrance exam. It seems that the Chinese campaign has had mixed results. While some parents have encouraged their children to value themselves using a wider set of criteria than those that measure merely academic achievement, the pressure on students to do well in exams is still quite intense. Indeed, it is often just this pressure that motivates Chinese parents who can afford it to send their children to study in the West at schools that do not demand the high-stakes testing of schools in China. The admission scandals that have recently surfaced in the United States suggest that wealthy American parents certainly believe that attending a prestigious US college is important, and they are willing to pay large bribes to ensure that their children gain entrance to such schools. Parents' increased desperation to buy their children a place in a first-year college class is caused not only by the weakening of shared moral standards, but also by the narrowing economic opportunities available in the contemporary neoliberal marketplace, as the increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of an ever smaller percentage of the population demonstrates the precarity of generationally continued class membership. Parents reacting to the squeeze on decently paying jobs are willing to lie, cheat, and steal to make sure that their children are positioned among the fewer and fewer golden ticket winners. More is now required to be in line for a slice of the ever smaller economic pie, the results of ever widening inequities of economic distribution. Wealthy parents are willing to pay up to assure that their children are among the lucky winners. Has parenting changed in response to children's decreasing opportunities to do as well as their parents did in the past? Is this the root of the intensive parenting practices that we see in the US and abroad? Are parents just worried about their children's economic futures when they struggle to give their children lessons and opportunities that allow them to develop their skills and abilities? Well, I think it would be a mistake to discount the impact of economic anxiety on parenting. It is reasonable, after all, to worry about the current downward slide in the economic order and the narrowing of economic prospects of the young in the West. Money and future jobs are an increasing focus of my students, parents, and administrators' attentions. My students today are more worried than they were when I first started teaching, before we got old. When I first started teaching, as states in the US have regularly cut aid to public colleges, and private colleges have struggled with declining populations of students and the shrinking of a middle class able to afford very steep increases in tuition costs. But just as I am sure social media has an effect on my students' lives and even on the texture and shape of their friendships, and that the demands of capitalism play some role in changes in parenting styles and in the mental health of today's gifted students, I don't think either are the sole reason for the collective shift to intensive parenting, nor that the angst and blues from which so many of today's students suffer are caused by helicopter parents. Surely all parents, not just the parents caught up in the college admissions scandal, are right to worry that without access to an excellent college education, their children may be left behind in an economic struggle that seems to lead to fewer and fewer jobs and lower incomes for more and more people. Surely, too, college experiences, including the exposure to diverse people and ideas, developing the ability to argue well, to entertain different points of view about the world, to present ideas coherently and work with many different kinds of people without unintentional insult or boorish cultural ignorance, is more important, given the global economy, than ever it has been before. Trump's hostility towards difference and his national isolationism, not to the contrary, withstanding, more and more kinds of well-paid work required that the young be able to understand and cope with diverse perspectives, multicultural experiences, and that they grasp and feel horizons comfortable with the full plurality of human beings, both within their own horizons and those beyond them. While many of these skills develop more fully during and after college, they first arise in the context of emotionally intensive parenting, not necessarily one that involves endless lessons and tutors and bribes to get into the college of one's dreams, but the intensive parenting that cultivate emotional skills like coping with difference, acknowledging and processing aggression, recognizing tendencies to omnipotence and the temptations of splitting, developing the ego strength needed for honest self-reflection, the embrace of human interdependence and one's own needs for support, as well as the ability to recognize the needs of others and an educated sense of how to respond to them. But there are other logics that justify the importance of intensive forms of parenting beyond their significance for success in a global economy. These are linked to valuing and adopting the political norms central to the aspirations of liberal democracy. The identity politics that have become so central to political struggle in the US since the 1950s turn on the ability to recognize and at least be able to tolerate, if not celebrate, people's various and often conflicting identities. As the US has become ever more diverse, the ability to exist, live, and work harmoniously with others here requires that we be able to maintain our own sense of self while also recognizing the legitimacy and rights of other selves. We need, in the words of psychoanalyst Jessica Benjamin, to be able to cope with what she calls the sting of the other. That is, to attend to and experience people's differences without hostile retaliation, even when we may feel threatened by such differences. As civil rights, feminists, disability, and queer activists have made clear over the past century, the political work of recognition is a key dimension of modern understandings of justice is not easy. It requires the constant reworking of the self and its understandings of others. empathetic responsivity must be accompanied not only by a recognition of difference, but by the possibility of validating such differences, while also being open to being critical of oneself. Such work cannot be undertaken by the faint of heart or by those not willing to consider their own historical role, whether intentional or not, in the oppression and exploitation of others. These forms of political recognition require skills that enable self-knowledge, affect regulation, emotional intelligence, self-discipline, and intrinsic motivation and internal sources of agency. Such psychic skills first develop in the family as parents interact with children and help them to manage their emotional experiences without defensiveness and teach them how to recognize the rights, needs, and legitimacy of another person's needs, rights, and value. Sophisticated parenting skills are needed if children are to develop these sophisticated psychic insights, and they can do so only in the context of deeply experienced emotional bonds. Developing such bonds takes time and a deep sensitivity to a child's experiences and feelings. It requires that parents work to understand what is going on in a child's mind, that they think and talk about a child as a person in its own right. It requires an attention to the link between psychic and moral development. It requires that parents be in touch with their children's fears, worries, and hopes. These dimensions of development must be valued along with the more typically recognized concerns about children's physical well-being, happiness, safety, academic education, and so on. Recently, both post-Freudian and more empirically oriented theories about infants and children's development have examined ever more closely the role that the experience of relationships plays in a child's development. While not denying that genetics and other biological factors contribute to the direction and relative security of an infant's development of sense of self and of others, or the significance of political realities and their impact on children, theorists have viewed the experience of relationship as ever more central to a child's developing ability to establish and maintain a reflective relation to itself and to others. While recognizing the importance of both language and cognition in this process, contemporary researchers believe that the initial connections to others that infants experience are effective in nature. Indeed, they argue that infants feel their way into subjectivity. Their affects, as Alan Shore, together with many others, has argued, are mediated by emotional connection to caregivers. The neural development of the brain is quite literally changed by interactions with caregivers, and neural connections and structures have long-term effects on the people that children become. One metaphor Anna Freud used to describe caregivers is viewing them as external egos that function until children can develop their own egos, the egos infants lack, and which can reflect children's experiences back to them, shaping and containing them as they do so. In the course of their responses to their children's affects, parents help children to become aware of their own feelings, and they modulate those feelings so as to make them more manageable for little ones to cope with. The process that developmental theorists describe is not mimetic, so it's not imitative. It is responsive, acknowledging the difference between the child's feeling and the adult response. Parents need not mimic a child's response, but can, for example, match a child's joy or pleasure while responding in a different medium. A child might bang a toy in joy, for example, while the parent may clap with the same rhythm. The shared rhythm says connection, while the difference in the mediums through which parents and children communicate underscores the distinction between the two selves. This kind of interaction sets the stage. It provides the scaffolding for future social interactions, ranging from simple being with experiences to complex linguistically mediated interactions, where significant differences and unifying similarities between ourselves and others can be experienced without collapsing one into the other or the other into the self. As children become adolescents, they can do more and more relational work themselves, building on the neural patterns that are connected to the psychic skills and insights first developed in relation to parents and later in relation to peers, teachers, and others. Obviously, the ability to handle conflict, ambivalence, and even hostility varies depending upon the learned skills and affective and cognitive insights gleaned from one's past experiences. The more complex the social worlds in which we live, the more important are the psychic skills needed to cope with those complexities. While sensitive and attuned parents can help a child to embrace and develop complex personal abilities that help mediate experiences that feel threatening, and over time, with learning, children can become adults that can better cope with their own and others' demands for political and personal recognition. If the world outside the family is not a space where such psychic expectations are met or even acknowledged, then the felt importance of one's own and others' rights to recognition will be thwarted, which might produce an even more urgent demand for recognition, or perhaps ever greater depression, anger, frustration, perhaps leading to isolation and withdrawal. In a world where demands for recognition are regularly violated, where one's own or those of whether one's own or those of others, people are likely to become frustrated, ashamed, alienated, and depressed. Indeed, I believe that one effect of intensive parenting, and by that I mean not the endless schedule of chores and tasks and lessons, that is, I mean emotionally astute and supportive parenting, is to enhance reflexivity, and doing so to expand expectations that others will respond to our shared fundamental humanity, genuine human needs, and our political rights. That is, in effect, the promise inherent in the claims of recognition at the heart of modern struggles for justice. The demand to be recognized as a person of moral worth with a right to be treated justly is at the heart of most of those struggles. But if intensive parenting supports the development of a sense that one is entitled to decency and that others are too, and in an ever more refined sense of violation of those demands, the world as it is and the world as it should be are likely to be less and less alike. It is, of course, true that there have always been contradictions at the heart of modernity that have made attaining the justice articulated and defended in the political arena difficult to attain. Sex, gender, racial relationships have long been nodes where failures of equality and decency have been more the rule than the exception. But another nexus of betrayal, one that transects other axes of injustice, can be traced to the earliest articulations of liberal political values. And that is, of course, the contradiction created by the undercutting of political relationships structured by justice, by the patently unjust and unfair economic relationships generated by the marketplace. Despite recognizing that human sociability takes many forms and that there are many reasons why people value being with other people that are not driven by their market desires, including, for example, that an infant's survival depends upon it, over the approximately 500 years of the development of Western political theory, theorists have persistently linked the origins of the social contract with the acquisition and protection of private property. Hobbes, who thought that the violence of humans in the state of nature was at the root of the justification of the absolute ruler, nonetheless viewed the protection of property and trading relationships to be critical to the state's claim to legitimacy. That it was not enough for the state to protect one's physical body. The state needed to protect the extension of one's body, that is, one's property. The Scottish moralists, Hume, Smith, Hutcheson, surely recognized human sociability to be rooted in other than market relationships. Mill singled out the companionships of husbands and wives as especially potent. Rousseau insisted on the importance of childhood and the relationships between children and parents. His own 5 children were sent to a foster home, so there's a gap between theory and practice there. And Burke, as I mentioned before, thought that social relations rooted in tradition and a sense of place were fundamental to law, to history, and to identity. He even preferred to invoke the rights of Englishmen rather than the more abstract rights defended by Enlightenment philosophers. The former had a spatial and historical locus cemented by institutions and traditions that added a patina of legitimacy to them, while the latter, abstract rights, floated about as abstract ideals lacking the history that endow appeals to right with credibility and motivate citizens to embrace them. Burke, despite his deep appreciation for relationships within the family, community, and state, and his eloquent reminders of their importance, at one point, nonetheless, located the aim and origin of justice in a marketplace that he described as the reason for the existence of the state. Indeed, he went beyond claiming that the protection of a free market is a mark of a state's legitimacy and claimed that a completely unregulated market was crucial for the realization of human freedom. In a snap of a finger, or more precisely, in a single ill-conceived book, Burke abandoned his passionate defense of the social ties that he had previously traced to experiences of neighborhood, society, community, family, and the collective experience of merry old England. In his monograph on modern economy, all these relationships previously viewed as crucial for all human beings were forgotten, as he identified the anonymous, competitive, and tradition-destroying dynamics of the marketplace as the expression of human freedom. As Judith Sklar notes, it is a good thing that Burke's foray into economics was brief and his book on economics rarely read, because it contradicted just about every other claim on which his reputation as a conservative, traditionalist Whig rested. Why these pages stick. How was it that someone like Burke, who clearly recognized the importance of effectively motivated social interactions, could also embrace a model of a society based on the, at best, amoral relationships characteristic of a wildly unregulated marketplace? As Susan Okin pointed out in the 1980s, one strategy that allowed Western political theorists like Burke to embrace the capitalist marketplace while still valuing non-instrumental relationships was by distinguishing the family from the market and drawing a cordon sanitaire between them. Thereby, at least in theory, the family could be viewed as a sphere in which love drove relationships, love in the guise of patriarchal power. Love provided a haven in a heartless world in which people, or rather men, could escape from the unequal and competitive relationships that dominated the marketplace. What is missing in Burke is also missing in classical Western political theory as a whole. That is, a significant grappling with the way that market-driven relationships are not just different from, but in conflict with other kinds of relationships. Even Hegel, who in the philosophy of right did try to map the complexity of modern social relationships and describe the relationship of the self to family, state, and marketplace, did not truly acknowledge the inevitable contradictions that arise between various forms of life and the different kinds of relationships that sustain them. Marx, of course, fully recognized the power of capitalism to melt all that is solid in human relationships into the air of exchange values, but he abandoned the idea of the state as a locus for justice, and with that abandoned the aims of liberal democracy altogether. In the course of our lifetimes, the liberal effort to sustain a distinction, however wobbly, between the norms of justice and the values of the market have collapsed. The neoliberal recasting of politics, begun by Reagan, continued by Clinton, and brought to full flower by Bush and then Trump, has stripped away any illusions that the modern world could have a political arena structured by the norms of justice and equality, while the rest was structured by the values of the marketplace. While liberal economic thought recognized that it took some horse trading to keep the dual structure of equality and the aims of the market from collapsing, and contradiction between politics driven by norms of justice and the recognition of right, and an economic sphere motivated solely by profit, were present from the first instantiations of liberal government. One need think only of the absolute contradiction in the American Constitution between the embrace of equal human rights and its defense of slavery, or even that enacted by excluding women from the franchise. Still, there were efforts to distinguish the aims of the polity from those of the marketplace. But in recent years, whether we consider the US under Trump or Thatcher's England, liberalism has given way to neoliberalism. It has staked a take-no-prisoners strategy that is evident in the no-holds-barred retraction of regulations, whether in banking or aircraft construction, the maximizing of free trade, the selling off of public services to private corporations, states' dedication to protecting corporate profits, and the gross exploitation of the environment in pursuit of profit. The continual challenging of welfarism and the threats to cuts in public education, all of these are strategies designed to subjugate all values to economic values. Neoliberalism, as Wendy Brown describes it, aims, quote, at extending and disseminating market values to all institutions and social actions. The effect of neoliberalism is to subordinate, quote, the political sphere along with every other dimension of contemporary existence to an economic rationality. Or put the other way around, not only is the human being configured exhaustingly as homo economicus, but all dimensions of human life are cast in terms of market rationality. Neoliberalism does not simply assume that all aspects of social, cultural, and political life can be reduced to such a calculus. Rather, it develops institutional practices and rewards for enacting this vision. Neoliberalism is a constructivist project. It does not presume the ontological givenness of a thoroughgoing economic rationality for all domains of society, but rather takes establishing it as its task. The development and dissemination and institutionalizing of such a rationality is its aim. Neoliberalism, then, is not just the continuation of liberalism by other means. It seeks to overcome the different logics that operated under liberalism, logics that were often at odds with one another, like the logic of justice versus the logic of the marketplace, the logic of recognition versus the exclusions and abuses of women, of racially and sexually excluded subjects, in order to create a seamless world that exclusively reflects a single logic, the logic of economic rationality. While Martin Luther King could still believe that the arc of the body politic bends towards justice, students now live in a world that makes little effort to even disguise the fact that social norms are motivated not by the demands of justice, but by an economic calculus that figures the economically successful entrepreneur and not the law-reforming statesman as its hero. Well, there was a time when there were economic reasons for families to have children. That time has long ceased to be. If anything, the financial costs of childbearing are higher than ever, and diminishing birth rates reflect the understanding of those high costs. But many people do continue to have children, and many people who do have children love them deeply and well. These relationships, these love relationships, are not explicable from a neoliberal framework any more than those relationships between spouses, friends, or neighbors. Even Aristotle, who was willing to acknowledge that being a good parent or even a good friend might require economic resources, knew that being a good parent or a good friend were not simply relationships that turned around the economic exchange value. It seems absurd that we have now managed to create a world where a parent's love for a child and a child's love for a parent must either be understood in neo-economic terms or chalked up to something inexplicable, given that the only relations intelligible and relevant to the world in which we now live are those of the marketplace. Even more discomforting is that the emotional learning that the liberal democratic struggles of the civil rights movements, the feminist movements, the gay and queer movements forced upon us, learning that changed the way we raise our children, changed the ways we responded to our parents, the way we understood our communities, or the worth and value of nature, have made our children more vulnerable to a world that was created while many of us were struggling to recognize and support their individuality, their promise, their rights, their needs. In teaching them that they were worthy of care, of respect, of support from others, as we all need support. In acknowledging that we cannot be selves except in relationship to other selves, did we betray them? In teaching our daughters that their bodies were theirs to make decisions about, that our sons were to be loved and respected, whatever models of masculinity they adopted, that children of all races should be loved and valued. Did we fail them? Did we not prepare them for a world where black boys are killed by cops, no girl's no is taken seriously, and the best candidate for a job is still a white man with a Ivy League degree? A liberal snowflake could thrive and even triumph in a world that valued such a creature, a world that recognized what it takes to keep such rare creatures alive and well, and if it worked to do so. But the world we live in is not that world. The world may be the icy cold of polar darkness that Weber once described the world of capitalism to be. But my students, my children, the students here at Denison, were never liberal snowflakes, but the locus of burning hot hopes for a different world, one that exceeds the norms of the marketplace and justifies the intensive parenting that right now may feed your anxieties and fears, but might someday show us all a better way to live. Thank you.